you. Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for this morning. We pray for your wisdom, your knowledge, understanding. Guide us during the discussion during the course of the next 2 days. We thank you for bringing us safely, and we ask you to bring us home safely after the week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Atalifo for blessing our evening today. I'll now call on our Director of Climate Change, Ms. Tagaloa, for your welcoming remarks.
Good morning. Good morning. It's not unusual to stand in front of a group and everybody looks like they're sleeping. But I know that some of you have just come off plans. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. Let me start by thanking our partners and friends. So, Director of Fiji Service, Terry Atalifo, representative of the SPREP member, Patrick, directors of the Meteorological Services in the Pacific, and the Met community who are here today, our partners who are online and in the room, and our partners in this event, Australia National University, welcome. As well as our partners from other universities, such as NUS, FNU, SPROS, USP, and University of Melbourne. I welcome you to the meeting here. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, both online and here in person in name, welcome you. I depart a little bit from my written remarks to say, as a Pacific Islander, just like a lot of you, we know that the Pacific we live in now is not the Pacific our ancestors arrived in. It is a very different Pacific. It is a Pacific. It is a region that is impacted by climate change. It is changed not only the way we live, to some extent, it has impacted things like our traditional knowledge, because we've lost some of our native biodiversity, we've lost some of the knowledge associated with it, especially around medicine and art and knowledge. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has released the final installment of the Sixth Assessment Cycle Report in March this year. After years of effort from experts, scientists, and governments from around the world, we are here to unpack that, to see what it means for our countries, for our region, and to see how it informs our decisions in each of the countries we live in. In that regard, I'm pleased to welcome you here. I'm pleased to welcome you to this dialogue, the AR6 Synthesis Report, which is hosted by SPREP through the Pacific Climate Change Center, also in partnership with partners who are here. And in drawing on the important conclusions of the report, it reflects our deep understanding of the climate science to date. It will become key and critical in the global stocktake, as well as when leaders and governments deliberate at COP28 this year in Dubai. All in all, and all things said, it is our desire to arrive at 1.5. That has been the Pacific's push, and many, partners trying to deter the Pacific from that, but we will not be deterred, because it's common knowledge, our survival depends this report comes at a decisive moment in time for climate action and for recognizing Pacific Islands goals. The Pacific Climate Change Center, in partnership with NEU, have hosted this event to discuss the main findings of the report. We also look at the way forward and how we use the findings of this report to further amplify the voice of the Pacific people. The Pacific Climate Change Center is mandated to generate and to offer not only relevant information, but information in a timely manner so that you can receive that information and use that information to implement development decisions, to implement your projects, design in particular, and also to influence the international dialogue and platform. Whilst we know that the Pacific is already vulnerable and impacted by climate change, we are also living in a time where many other regions are also impacted. That then impacts our ability to some degree in a competing environment for finances, appropriate finances that are accessible to help our countries adapt to climate change. Last night when I arrived, I was handed these. These are fact sheets that we developed with our partners at NEU, and I want to encourage you all to use them. Use them when you do your cabinet briefings, use them to discuss in-country matters that impact that are impacted by climate change and influence national positions. We've used these fact sheets, and I haven't told mine, but we use these fact sheets to inform our briefings to countries that go into the climate change negotiations. We use these fact sheets in the development of bills that are being handed to our leaders and to our ministers, so they can refer, not just talk about climate change, not just talk about the impacts of climate change in the Pacific, but to talk about facts. And so these fact sheets are very important in the work that we do, and I thank you for the partnership in this. The communication of these fact sheets is being largely in the Pacific done by the center staff. You've heard from Yvette, some scientific services advisor in the center. Her job is to make sure you receive these things in a timely manner. And today is one of the activities in meeting that role. Again, I acknowledge all of the partnerships. The government of Australia for its support as well, but also the government of Japan that developed the Centre for Excellence and hosted by SPREP, the governments of New Zealand, as well as the governments of Ireland that support the work through the centre. I look forward to hearing the exchange of information. I look forward to talking with the delegates here today. Some of you who I feel like I haven't seen for a long time, and some of you that I just met people recently, and some of you that I don't see but hear from on email quite a lot, like Papa and Lutheran, and sometimes too. I wish you all the best. I encourage you to not just get involved in the dialogue today. Welcome, George. But I also encourage you to work with each other, exchange ideas. And for those of you who haven't met our net directors, they are in the room. We have Terry from Fiji, Offa from Tonga, as well as Terry from Samoa. And I came tonight. I didn't see it before. So at this table, I think maybe we need to mix you all up So there's one at every table, but I welcome you and I encourage everyone else to get to know them. They are the first line of information that goes out in times of disasters, and also the first line to advise the public through their official channels. So I welcome you all here today, and I look forward to meeting everybody as the day progresses. And I hope that you really benefit from the findings of this report and use it in your deliberations and position development in your own countries. And so with that, on behalf of my Director General, Sepanaya, the SPREP Secretariat, I say, we're lucky in my age, and Patison in Mama.
Tagaloa Director, for your opening remarks, highlighting the importance of the synthesis report, but also on the use of fact sheets that also breaks down the language, but also in terms of delivering our science services to our different audiences in the Pacific, as well as our people in the communities. We have another round of applause for our director. Next on our program, I would like to invite the Director for Fiji Meteorological Services, Mr. Atalifo, for your keynote address.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and very good morning to you all. I was just telling Tagaloa now she made my task a bit difficult. Because, when Tagaloa speaks with a wealth of experience, it's quite difficult for the speakers that line up after that. But thank you, Tagaloa, for the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to say very good morning to you all, and welcome to Fiji. While I was scanning through the room, it's a different audience as we Met directors are used to. We have new faces in the room, different partners, and I think we would like to get to know each other very well by the end of these 2 days. So we have delegates from the Pacific, representatives from crop agencies, UN agencies, our partners, NGOs, academic institutions, our research organizations, our friends from the Pacific Climate Change Center. Can I have a raise of hands, all those from the PCC, offered in some of these? Fred, you are familiar with Tagaloa? Okay. It's nice to see the friends from PCC. Yeah, and distinguished guests, like I said, it's an honor and a great pleasure to be part of this Pacific Regional Dialogue and Engagement. And on behalf of the Fiji government, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to SPREP, the Pacific Climate Change Center, for the invitation to open this regional dialogue and engagement. The Pacific Regional Dialogue, IPCC Synthesis Cycle, Synthesis Report, and facilitate engagement for IPCC assessment, reporting, and research. Mouthful. We all know that the Pacific Climate Change Center has hosted a series of IPCC Pacific webinars in partnership with Australian National University. And these regional dialogues will provide a summary for the most up-to-date information on IPCC Synthesis Report of Pacific Island audience, as well as discuss the challenges and opportunities for engagement along the work of IPCC. And I think we're all looking forward to hear this up-to-date information. Again, the regional dialogue will also provide a stocktake of prioritized areas of research that will inform the development framework for Pacific research, and of course, everything else that we do. The climate crisis is real and it's here. Human-caused climate change is affecting
region affecting nature and people. Moreover, scientific evidence over the past 7 years has shown that severe climate risks lie at lower levels of global warming than previously assessed, underscoring the urgency of action to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Climate crisis can only be addressed through cooperation between people. That's why we all here this morning, communities, cultures, and generations. And the message is very clear. We have never been equipped before to solve the challenges of our changing climate. We must act without delay because specific small island development states are at the forefront of all these climate crises. Governments must accelerate climate action, peak emissions before 2025, and halve them by 2030. Our action during this decade is vital to tackle all these issues about our changing climate. This final IPCC report confirms once again there's no justification for delay. Now I'd like to reiterate the important role that science plays in informing climate process, providing critical evidence and facts to build the case of climate action and urgency for implementation. In the Pacific, we need science-based solution. It is a definite, and from scientific research to help move assessments, plans, and implementation with William Rowan behind. We would like to acknowledge, just like how Tagaloa did earlier, all the partnership, especially with our own governments in the Pacific, the research institutions, donor partners, civil society, the private sector, the Pacific community, Pacific Climate Change Center, and the Australian National University. The government of Fiji again is committed and continues to offer support to the Secretariat and the Pacific Climate Change Center in its vision to keep this 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, with sound, evidence-based policy making for us to secure the future generation of our Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to the information sharing in the course of the next 2 days, and we'd like to wish everyone a successful and an enjoyable Tagaloa session. And now we'd like to declare this meeting open. Thank you.
Atalifo Director, for your keynote address, also highlighting that the message is clear. We need everything we need to limit warming to 1.5, and our action needs to be in line with the latest science findings, including the synthesis report. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our formalities for this morning. And next on our agenda is the most important part and also exciting part, and that will be the lecture summary of the synthesis report. And I'll now like to introduce Professor Mark Howden. He is an honorary professor and also vice chair of the International Panel of Climate Change. He's also the chair of the ACT and Climate Change Council. So Mark has worked on climate change issues over 30 years. Issues he has addressed include agriculture, food security, natural resource-based ecosystems, biodiversity, energy, water, and urban systems. So that's covering a lot of sectors. Mark has over 420 publications of different types. He helped develop both the national and international greenhouse gas inventories, and those are fundamental part of the Paris Agreement. He's also assessed sustainable ways to address emissions. Most importantly, he is a major contributor to the IPCC since 1991, with roles in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and we are now in the sixth assessment reports. So indeed, we are looking forward to working closely with you and our other partners for the second assessment report. But he also shares the 2000 Nobel Peace Prize with other IPCC participants and also Al Gore. Thank you for your patience, Professor Mark, and I now invite you for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Readiness, and it's a pleasure to be here and also to work with the Pacific Climate Change Center on this roundtable event but also more generally on communicating IPCC and other science to the Pacific. So what I'm going to cover today is a very quick snapshot of an incredibly complex document and series of documents. So it's a very quick overview of the contents of the recent IPCC Synthesis Report. And as Yvette and also Tagaloa said, we've also got fact sheets which have been prepared for this synthesis report, as well as for the previous work group 1, 2, and 3 reports. They're available off that website. I'll just put up there the new Pacific website. And so if we just go to the next slide, yes. So just a few sort of quick stats about the synthesis report. So the synthesis report is the summary of the previous reports in the IPCC cycle. So we've had 3 special reports: the land report, the oceans report, and the 1.5 degrees report. Then we've had the working group 1 report on climate science, working group 2 report on the impacts of adaptation, and working group 3 report on emission reduction. So the synthesis report brings together information across all of those different reports and puts it into a much shorter report format for policy makers. So in the synthesis report, there was about 93 people involved in the writing and review editing of that. Those people were drawn from 43 countries across the world. About 40% were from developing countries, 60% from developed countries, so there's still a bit of work to do there. Similarly, not a completely equal gender split, so 44% women, 56% men. There was a lot of review comments, so there's 7,000 or so review comments in the last round of IPCC, and this synthesis report covers around about 12,500 pages of material, drawing from about 50,000 scientific references, so different publications. So an extraordinary amount of information collapsed into this relatively short report, which I'm going to give a very short summary of. So just a quick sort of coverage of this, and of course this is a a very sort of skate over a complex topic. So yeah, the next slide, please. So just as I already mentioned, temperatures across the globe are already going up. They're around 1.1 degrees on the decadal scale. Above pre-industrial level, that's about 1.24 degrees on a trend basis above pre-industrial levels. That's an extraordinary increase. It doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a really big increase in temperature that we've seen already, and that's driven by human activity through greenhouse gas emissions. When we look out into the future, we see the evolution of how these temperatures might change at different temperature points, 1.5 to 3 and 4 degrees. So this is one of the key figures from the synthesis report. And we can see that even at 1.5 degrees, which is on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see that temperatures go up right across the globe, but they go up differently in different places. So if you're in the middle of a continent, you tend to go up faster in temperature than if you're in the middle of the ocean, and so Pacific. If you're at the poles, both North and South Pole, the temperatures tend to go up faster than they do around the equatorial zones. And you can see also that if we, on an average, increase the temperature across the globe, we see that everywhere it increases in temperature, there is no place that escapes that. And again, those temperature differentials hold. But we can also see that that brings out equity issues, geographical disparities between places. So some places get a lot more temperature increases than others, so some places hit harder than others. And so we see one of the core themes through the synthesis report, which is issues of equity are raised throughout. So we can see that already we can see sort of unequal sort of distributions across the globe. So Mark, next slide, please. And those also are reflected in terms of changes in rainfall. So this is, again, one of the graphs which shows changes in rainfall intensity across the globe at different temperatures, global average temperature increases. Importantly, for the South Pacific, we can see, or for the Pacific generally, we can see that there's a big band across the equatorial Pacific where those intensities go up a lot. not so much in other parts of the Southwest Pacific. But average rainfall is likely to decrease in this part of the Pacific, and rainfall very little increase because of the increased extreme nature of El Nino, La Nina events. So we're tending to get, even if the average rainfall doesn't increase, the variability of rainfall will tend to increase. So the drought will become a bit harder, and the wet season will become wetter and flood risk higher as a result of that. You go to the next slide, please. If we look at another aspect of equity, is intergenerational equity. And this is one of the core drivers concerned about climate change, because what we do today affects people in a century from now, or even 2 centuries from now, as I'll show you. So this is one of the graphs that came out of IPCC, and this shows how temperatures may evolve under different emission scenarios. So going from very high to the very low. So the very low is roughly with 1.5 degrees, and very high would take us to 4 or 5 degrees global temperature increase. And we can see in this graph that it's sort of, it tries to pick out that intergenerational aspect. So if we look down the bottom part of the graph, we can see that someone who's around about 70 years from now, 70 years old now, has actually lived through a very different climate from someone who's born today. And so someone who's born today will live their life in a climate which is very, very different from that their grandparents lived in. And they will live through an environment of extreme events, which is very different from that their grandparents lived in. So on average, a person who has been born today or just been born will live through like 3 to 4 times as many extreme events as their grandparents did through their lives. And in some parts of the world, that's many times more than that. So there's an intergenerational aspect of equity as well. The world we are leaving our children and grandchildren is up to us to choose. We can go on a low emission scenario and have it moderately increase risk, or we can go on a high emission scenario and a lot of increase in risk. That's our choice that we're making in terms of greenhouse gas emissions at a global scale. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now, these temperatures are already starting to impact on systems across the globe. So we've seen in this IPCC reports document the impacts climate change are already having on water systems, on ecosystems, on urban systems, on human health, on biodiversity, on fish species distributions, and various other things. So we're seeing accumulating evidence that climate change is already impacting on systems right now. We don't have to wait for 10 or 20 or 50 years. It's impacting on systems right now. And if we look at these couple of graphs, there's just these just 2 or several of these. So it looks at how both heat and humidity risks to human health change with different temperatures, and also how fisheries yield changes with different temperatures. And on the top, if we look at that, that's essentially heat risk. This is a combination of heat and humidity, which makes it difficult for a human body to actually get rid of our internally generated heat. So at core temperature rises, that causes us to become sick, and in extreme cases to die. So that's what the heat and humidity risk is reflecting. We can see that if we look on the left-hand side, even at 1.5 degrees, which is what the Pacific has led the world to actually adopt as a goal, we see very significant increases in the heat risk associated with climate change. And that's particularly so in developing countries. So those areas which are darkened on that screen are almost all developing countries. So we see in that issue of equity coming out. As the temperatures go up, we see that heat risk accumulating very significantly. So on the right-hand side, we can see that big parts of the world suffer from heat risk almost all year under those large climate changes. If we look at the bottom couple of panels, they're changes in fishery productivity, marine system productivity, and under different temperatures. And we can see that right across the equatorial regions, but particularly the Pacific, we can see reductions in fishery productivity are projected in the future. A few places in the world actually have increases, but they tend to be right up towards the Arctic and some down towards the Antarctic as well. And but particularly if you look at that zone around the Southwest Pacific, there's projected very significant reductions in marine system productivity, fishery productivity. So likely not only changes in fishery distribution, so fisheries on average tend to move south in this part of the world, but reductions in the productivity of those fisheries. So significant impacts there. If we look at the next slide, please, just waiting for that one. Let's do the lag there. And of course, a critical issue for Pacific is sea level rise. And this is just effectively picking up information from the Ocean Report and the Working Group 1 report. But down the bottom is the scenarios of sea level rise going up to 2100 in the main panel. And you can see the coloured sort of lines there are those different emission scenarios, whether we go on a high emission scenario or a low emission scenario. So if we go on a high emission scenario, which fortunately we don't seem to be on any longer, we'd actually have sea level rise by the end of the century, something like a metre above where it was pre-industrial. If we go on a low emission scenario, it's about half that, so roughly half a metre of sea level rise compared with the long term. And so neither of those are trivial numbers, but it does show that moving off the high emissions trajectory does make a difference in terms of sea level rise by the end of the century. And importantly, the panels on the right-hand side show what might happen by the year 2100, 2150, and also 2300. So that's the big vertical bar on the right-hand side. And importantly, sea level rise is a very slow burning issue. So we've already committed ourselves to future sea level rise by our parts of greenhouse gas emissions. The question at this stage is not whether we're going to have sea level rise, but how much and how fast that's going to occur. And that depends on our greenhouse gas emissions globally. And importantly, the longer you leave it, the further out you look, the higher those sea levels are. So if we start to look at 2300 projection for sea level rise, you can see that they're measured in several meters rather than single meters or some parts of the meter. And so the message here is that it's really important not just to look at 2100, because yes, some people who are just been born now will actually be alive in 2100, but their children and their grandchildren will be living in those subsequent centuries, and they will be the ones who are getting hit by those really extreme levels of sea level rise. So important again to think about that intergenerational component there. And even now, we're seeing increased flood events around the coasts of the world due to the sea level rise we've already seen, and that's likely to increase significantly. So very, very significant increases in the frequency of flood events around the coasts. And we can see that number there, 20 to 30 times more by 2050, affecting more than 1 billion people across the globe. Now, really importantly, is that these numbers will change. What we're seeing right now is an increased level of concern in the science community about the breakdown rates of both the Greenland ice sheets, but also West Antarctica and now East Antarctica. And so almost on a weekly basis, I see new scientific studies which either document the more rapid breakdown of those ice sheets and hence sea level rise, or threatening processes to those ice sheets. So changes in the Antarctic currents was just a study from last week. So we need to be very aware that these may be underestimates for sea level rise, and again, reinforcing the need for rapid action in terms of reducing emissions. Next slide, please. So, you know, a lot of this looks pretty challenging and problematic for Pacific Islands, and I think it is, and so we need to be thinking positively about what we can do about this. So when we look at this, we need to start to assess the risks associated with different levels of climate change. So these are what we call the burning embers diagrams in the IPCC. So they're a sort of standard figure which we produce in the IPCC. And essentially they're a risk diagram. So the more red the colour, the higher the risk. And we can see that these are aligned so that they're vertically aligned with temperature increase. So So they go from 0 temperature increase at the bottom of each of those coloured bars up to 4 and 5 degrees at the top. And these are categorized and have been since the assessment into 5 different categories. So these are sort of the top level risks. And we can see that on the left-hand side of those bars, it's unique and threatened species. So you can think of that as ecosystem risk. Then we've got extreme weather events, distribution of impacts, so that includes the economic impacts, global aggregate impacts, and then large-scale singular events, that's like the breakdown of the Atlantic Ocean circulation. And what we have there is the main bar is the 6th assessment report assessment of risk, and the skinnier bar next to it is the same assessment from the previous report, the 5th assessment. And the important thing here to note is firstly that different risks, different risk categories evolve risk at different temperatures. So at a given temperature, you can have different levels of risk depending on the category you're looking at. Secondly, is that if you look at the skinny bar versus fat bar, so it's the 5th assessment versus 6th assessment, in all cases, we've actually seen the assessed risk getting worse at any given temperature. So the red part of the bar comes further down the graph. So essentially, the more we know about risk in climate change, the more concerned we are about risk in climate change, because our assessed risk is higher at any given temperature. We go to the next slide, please. And so that particular sort of format allows us to assess different emission trajectories against different evolved risks for different systems. So when we look at some more specific systems here, so these are both land-based systems and ocean-based systems here, we can see the risk bars for different components. So on the land-based systems, we have wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, not a big issue for the Pacific Islands, biodiversity, dryland water scarcity, etc. And we can see that for those different categories, there's different levels of risk depending on what you're looking at, whether it's the trees or water systems, etc. And similarly, if we go on the right-hand side, we're looking at ocean-based systems. The first of those columns are the warm water corals, our coral reefs, then kelp forests and seagrass, etc. And again, different levels of risk. So, say for the tropical coral reefs, we're already seeing significant damage from the climate change at 1.1 degrees. And at 1.5 degrees, we would like to see very, very significant 70–90% damage across our coral reefs. By the time we get to 2 degrees, effectively they're gone. And so, or at least gone in their current locations. And you can see, so that bar that turns red and then sort of purple colours at fairly low temperatures, reflecting the high degree of vulnerability and sensitivity for tropical coral reefs. Now, importantly, going back to our last assessment, we had to actually include a new category of these risk assessments that are bars. And that was essentially the sort of crimsony colour at the top of those bars. And that actually reflects irreversible or effectively irreversible and unmanageable large-scale risks. Because our previous assessment, which got finished with the red bar, was actually none. Those extreme risks, the literature now identifies in different circumstances. So if we go to the next slide, please. And but importantly, what we also looked at was how adaptation activities, so how to adapt to these changes, could reduce those risks. And this is what these particular bars show. In this case, it's the heat-related stress or heat stress. And you can see on the left-hand side of those bars, that's the risk with limited adaptation. Then there's some incomplete adaptation, but at least some adaptation, and then fairly proactive adaptation. And under these scenarios, not only is the risk reduced at any given temperature, but also because this is linked into a whole series of other activities, a broader scale socioeconomic pathway, the total temperature is also reduced because people are somewhere gas emissions, so there's a part of the socioeconomic pathway next slide. So if we look also at this IPCC report, it assessed the feasibility of both adaptation options and emission reduction options. And I'll just And just, I put this up not so you could read it, but just so you can see that there's a whole series of different categories, each of which is being addressed in terms of the feasibility of adaptation and mitigation. If we go to the next slide, Mahalani, I'll just zoom in on part of this and just looking at the land-based systems and just waiting for the flag to come through. And so what this shows, and I'll just focus on the left-hand side at the moment, is it shows different systems and different adaptation options and their feasibility. The feasibility is the little blue squares and the dots indicate confidence in the feasibility of those adaptation options. And you can see right across the sector, the assessed literature shows that there's lots and lots of things we can do to adapt to climate change. So it's not as though we are, without ability to respond to the changes that are coming down the track to us. And so that's a really important message, that we are not, just the victims of climate change. We can be significant actors in terms of taking out some of the risks from climate change. We go to the next slide, please. And so one of the really important parts of the report was looking at the progress we've had and seen and observed in terms of adaptation responses to climate change. So the summary of that is on this slide is that even though we have seen adaptation to climate change occurring in many different parts of the world, is that adaptation progress is slower than it needs to be to keep up with climate change in aggregate. And adaptation gaps exist. So there's a gap between where we think rationally we should be doing, what we should be doing in terms of adaptation, and where we actually are. And importantly, that adaptation gap is largest amongst poor people across the world, and it is likely to grow with climate change. So those gaps are likely to increase under climate change. Unfortunately, the report also identifies that most observed adaptation responses to date are fragmented, they're incremental, so they're tweaking existing systems. They're quite sector specific, and they're unequally distributed regions. So some places are doing it much better than others, as you might expect. But also identifies there's lots of barriers to effective adaptation, including lack of adaptation finance. So of the climate change finance across the globe, something like 7 to 8% of that is being spent on adaptation. Whereas, arguably or rationally, maybe it should be closer to 50%, and that's been acknowledged by the Green Climate Fund, amongst others. So there are lots of barriers, things that are preventing us from taking on adaptation, but there's also known solutions to overcoming those barriers. So we know how to deal with some many of those barriers, but we're not necessarily doing that at this point in time. Importantly, it identifies that adaptation options which are effective and are feasible today are likely to become less effective under climate change. So our ability to adapt actually decreases as the climate changes further. So the consequences of climate change will grow. Again, an argument for keeping temperatures down through emission reductions. And lastly, it's making the point that effective adaptation responses can also result in reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and also enhance sustainable development. And in fact, the thrust of virtually the whole series of reports effectively of the IPCC says you can't have sustainable development without effective climate action, and you can't have effective climate action without sustainable development. So there's a very strong linkage throughout the reports on sustainable development. So next slide, please. And so that's just picking up some of the key threads in terms of adaptation. But also we need to focus on the emission reduction side of things. And this is the key graph from the synthesis report, which looks at different emission reduction pathways. And unfortunately, our implemented policies don't do the job that's needed. So these are policies coming from the NDCs of governments, the stated positions of governments, and the actions that they're taking. And what we see is that if we keep with our implemented policies, we end up something like around about 3 degrees above pre-industrial. So we don't hit either the 2 degrees or the 1.5 degrees mark. To do that, we have to move from those trajectories to the orange trajectories up the top, down to the green and blue trajectories down at the bottom, which are more consistent with 1.5 or 2 degrees. And you can see that there's a huge gap between what we're doing and what we need to be doing to be consistent with the Paris Agreement goals there. Next slide. And so one of the ways of looking at that is what we call the carbon budgets. So because there's effectively a linear relationship between accumulated carbon dioxide emissions and temperature, we can establish what we call a carbon budget, which is effectively the amount of carbon dioxide we can emit and be consistent with any given temperature. So in the case of say a 1.5 degrees temperature increase, as a couple of years ago, we could emit around about 500 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide and stick to the 1.5 degrees temperature. In the case of over 2 degrees, it's roughly about 1,000 billion tonnes of the carbon dioxide we can emit and stick to that temperature. And that's the top bars there, which actually just look at the carbon budget associated with different temperatures. The challenge here, though, is just our existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So all our coal-fired power stations and gas-fired power stations, etc., by themselves will chew through the budget that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. So not including emissions from transport or industry or agriculture or waste management, etc., just from the fossil fuel infrastructure we've got sitting on the ground at the moment. If that lives out to its expected lifespan, we will actually blow the 1.5 degrees temperature target. If we look at the 2 degrees side of things, that will almost be chewed through by the existing fossil fuel infrastructure plus the planned infrastructure. So, the things that are on the drawing board at the moment. And that's again without including transport, agriculture, etc. So you can see that there's a huge task ahead of us to decarbonise our electricity systems and our energy systems generally. And this is a really important part. It's not just a thing that Australia has to come to grips with, but also Pacific Islands. So just this morning I was reading an article which talked about electricity prices in the Solomons and Cook Islands, Vanuatu, etc., really high electricity prices and the implications of that for development. And that those prices are particularly high because you're using diesel. Diesel is really expensive in many of those cases. And so, whereas if you actually move to renewables, it's a much, much cheaper proposition. So we go to the next slide. And so renewable electricity is now the cheapest form of energy in the history of humankind. It is cheaper than any other form of energy that we've ever had. And so this is what this graph again shows. It's the same graph I showed you before, but in this case, if you focus on the right-hand side, these are different options for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And if we zoom in, next slide. Just looking at parts of that, in this case, it's the built infrastructure. We can see that a lot of emission reduction activity is that little blue color on those the bars on the right hand side of this picture. And so those blue colors are that emission reduction can happen either very cheaply or at a better profit, that it's a negative cost. So the in many cases it's shifting away from fossil fuels to renewables and similar emission reductions pays us to do it because it's actually a very cheap thing to do. It actually, the lifespan, for example, of the electric vehicle over the life, it's actually cheaper to run an electric vehicle now than it is to run a diesel vehicle, if you look at, say, numbers coming out of Europe. And so across the lifespan, it actually makes economic sense now to be moving towards low emission options. And that's one of the key messages. There's lots and lots of things we can do to reduce emissions at very low cost, or sometimes at that problem. And if we look at the potential demand side reductions coming out of the synthesis report, they're very large. So those the text on the right hand side there, which actually shows the potential demand side reductions across different sectors. So for electrification of our electric systems, potentially 73% reduction by around 2050. For transport and buildings, 2/3 reduction. For food, 44% reduction. Industry, 1/3 reduction. So there's lots and lots of possibilities to actually reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. Again, the problem is we're actually just not doing it yet fast enough to actually meet the 1.5 degrees temperature targets. And the last point that I make is buried in this report in paragraph C 2.4 is a statement which I think brings together a whole stack of different things, which is a simple statement which just says the global benefit of climate action in a simple economic sense far outweighs the cost of climate action. It's economically sensible, economically rational to take action on climate change right now. And that's just the sort of energy system changes. That's focusing on the energy system changes. It's not actually including all the avoided damages of, impacts on our coral reefs, impacts on our agriculture, impacts on health. So when we actually look at that balance between the cost and benefit, it's likely to even grow if we can do a much better assessment. So that's a really important message to leave on. The core message here is that now climate action is very, very clearly the thing that we should be doing, no longer afford climate inaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mark, for your interesting presentation, giving a summary of the background of the IPCC AR6 reports, latest projections, and looking at climate trends today, response options, and most importantly, the selection of key findings relevant to the Pacific. We know that there are some questions online. We're supposed to break. Just asking the audience if it's okay if we can just answer some of the burning questions online. And then after that, we can break and have our panel session and go through the in-person, if that's all right with everyone. Okay, I'll just provide the mic to. So interesting feedback online. We have here, thank you greatly for your presentation from Michael Roman. Thank you greatly for your presentation on the scientific findings. Every time I review data like this, I feel like I'm walking through the book of Revelations. What, if any, impacts do you predict coming from the ICJ advisory opinion go on these numbers and projections? You want me to go through the questions, and we can, I'll just go through the questions and yeah. Another question from Stephen Chip is, what are the implications of climate change projections for Pacific food security? Another one from Mark Charles. Dear Honorable Professor, could you please specify how maladaptation is analyzed or addressed in the latest IPCC work? And how could you illustrate the risk of maladaptation with one or two concrete examples in Pacific Island countries and territories? Maybe one more, and then I'll give the floor to Professor Mark. Could you please specify how maladaptation is analyzed and addressed in the latest IPCC work, and how you could illustrate the risks? So those, yeah, maybe we'll take those for now, and then we break it.
Thanks a bit. Thanks a bit for those. So just very quickly, food security. So clearly, when we get extreme events, they can impact on food security and food availability across the Pacific. What we're seeing already is an increase in the proportion of cyclones of category 3, 4, and 5. That's the really nasty ones, which do have those very large scale impacts. And those that sort of increase in the intensification of cyclones is likely to increase with climate change as our oceans warm. So there's a sort of an extreme event sort of element there through cyclones. Obviously, if as projected, El Nino and La Nina increase in their intensity across the Pacific, that also brings swings of dry years and wet years, which also impacts on food security. We also see rising sea levels, which in some island groups is resulting in salinization of soils and shrinking of the freshwater lens across the under the soil and restricting freshwater access to plants and again impacting on food security. And lastly, as temperatures increase, the water demands, even if you've got the same amount of water, you actually need more water to actually provide the same sort of growth of your crops. So because the evaporative demand increases, so you're effectively becoming drier, even if your rainfall has changed. And then if you're a water-fed, rain-fed crop, that can have significant impacts. And I should actually also mention, of course, in terms of food security and fisheries, with changes in marine productivity and changes in distribution of fisheries, that's also going to impact on people's livelihoods and food security. So there's many, many different ways in which climate change can impact on food security across the Pacific. The second question is particularly relating to maladaptation. So maladaptation is effectively where people are responding to what they see in terms of climate change or what they're projecting, but their response isn't an effective response. So it actually increases risk rather than decreases risk. So one example of that would be, for example, removing mangroves and similar coastal vegetation and putting in a concrete seawall or some similar structure, which actually tends to increase erosion around that seawall and increase the problems. And eventually those seawall type defences get overtopped, and the areas behind, which have actually been developed in a sort of protected mode and capitalised as a result of that, then get made very vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. As one example of this, in Australia, just about this time last year, there's a town called Lismore. They built a levee bank, like a wall around the river to keep the river, and when it's in flood, from flooding the town. And so that they built that, I think it was 14 meters high, and it's a pretty big wall. And they thought this was going to be fine, so they capitalised the town, built the town behind that, and so there's lots of expensive buildings and things. The problem is the flood that happened was 17 meters high last year, and so because there was a lot of capitalisation because of the defence and people thought they were safe, it actually ultimately made them more vulnerable under those extreme circumstances. So it's an example of maladaptation. An alternative way of adapting to that changing flood risk is actually move the infrastructure, so moving the town, and that's where a lot of the discussion that's happening in Australia is what are the costs and benefits of relocation of places. And it's not easy, there's a lot of economic costs as well as a lot of social and psychological pain associated with relocation. And so these are not trivial issues to be discussed, but they're not, they have been dealt with many times in human history. And so there's many examples in human history where people have relocated because of changing climate risk.
Thank you, Professor Mark. I'll just open it to the floor if there's any burning questions that any of our participants would like to ask. If not to worry, there's also a panel session where there will also be time that we would also ask further questions. I think now, we have one question. Could Thank you, Professor, for that comprehensive presentation. I have a question in terms of energy. Are there any findings on the relationships between emerging antifouling agents and fuel consumption of commercial vessels in the Pacific? Are there any findings based on the research on the data there on the relationships between the emerging antifouling agents and fuel consumption of commercial vessels in the Pacific? because it could be one of contributors to climate change.
So I think we're undergoing, significant sort of changes in sort of cost structures of marine transport and also technologies of marine transport. And so there's, for example, under the Glasgow Agreement, there was a climate bank declaration which identified green shipping routes across the globe to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the shipping industry, which is around about 3%, I think, of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a recognition of, the greenhouse gas implications of shipping. There's now moves to use wind-based power for some ships, as well as using renewable sources of fuel, such as methanol. And so just to cut down on the greenhouse gas implications of shipping. And associated with that will be a whole range of other sort of changes in design of ships and probably size of ships. So as you move to getting wind-based type of systems, the massive ships are no longer probably the best option, and so they'll move to different structures for ships, I think, over a period of time. But some of the biggest shipping lines like NAS are already moving on this. So their new ships are dual fueled diesel and methanol ships. So they're saying we're going to be part of the change rather than be reluctant.
Thank you, Professor Mark. It was indeed a privilege, and also just to acknowledge that Professor Mark was also at the launch of the Sixth Assessment Report. I think with our other Pacific directors, you did mention that Rona was there, and that's one of the main objectives of these sessions is how we can be more involved, how can we be more engaged with the IPCC process. We have a round of applause for. Just before we break, just a few announcements. Just to note that the bathroom is on this side. Also, we have a water refill station at the back. And this is environmental guidelines for our workshop. So will be paperless. So everything, don't worry, all the presentations, fact sheets have been circulated by email, and we also put it on our website. We also practice recycling, so at the back you can see there's the different papers that you have or that we will generate. And also just to note the DSA, thank you for your patience, especially our Pacific colleagues. Your DSA will be distributed during the lunch hour. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that ends our first session. I'll now like to invite you for our group photo just outside, and then morning tea. And maybe if we could all reassemble around 10:45, if that's okay. And if we can just have a round of applause for our audience here in the front. Thank you, everyone. And a round of applause for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will start our next session, which is the Tagaloa session. I want to welcome you all back and hope that you've enjoyed your morning tea. My name is Prof Patison. I am the Climate Finance Readiness Advisor at SPREP, based in the Pacific Climate Change Center. So I am in an unfamiliar territory, but I hope that I'll be able to facilitate our session this morning in a manner that is satisfactory to all of us. So, as you would all would be aware of, the session for this month for the Tagaloa session is to has a number of objectives, and I will go through them quickly. Really, it's to enhance the Pacific region's awareness and capacity around the work of the IPCC. And I think Professor Howden has provided a great summary of the IPCC Synthesis Report. For this session as well, we'll have some discussion on the knowledge of the Pacific region and the IPCC process, and the future engagement of the Pacific Island countries, especially those of you who are involved in the science sector. We will also look at how the IPCC process relates to the research and science observations and UNFCCC process, in particular, those of you involved in the negotiations. And for this session, we will also have a discussion on the key role and the function of the Pacific Climate Change Center on applied research and science services. During the end of the week, we will have some discussions on our research and partnership framework. It would be good that some of the discussions that we have this morning would capture what the framework that we would like to establish under the Pacific Climate Change Center. Without further ado, I will introduce our panel members. In front are the distinguished panel members, ladies and gentlemen. I think Professor Howden has been introduced. Next to him is Mr. Offa. He is the, just a moment, I'm trying to find this. He's the Director of Meteorology in Kona. And also a champion for the Pacific Weather Ready program. He has extensive experience in meteorology and climatology, and contributed to a number of Pacific published articles. And he is involved in the climate change negotiations in the area of science under the UNFCCC negotiation process. Let's give a hand for Mr. Offa, please, ladies and gentlemen. Next to Offa is Dr. Letero. I think he is quite known within the region by now. He has worked in the field of meteorology for over 15 years in Samoa. He is an author of the IPCC Working Group Report 1. He graduated with a Doctor of Science in Meteorology from the Nagoya University in Japan. He is one of the most senior meteorological scientists in Samoa and also in the region, and has extensive experience in meteorology, climate science, and contributed to a number of published articles and publications as well. Let's give a hand for Dr. Letero. We have a fourth speaker. Unfortunately, he is not here, Mr. Aaron Larry. He's the Director of Med for the Cook Islands. Unfortunately, his flight didn't connect well to make it today, but we convey his apologies. When he joins us maybe tomorrow, hopefully, please feel free to talk to him as well, as he has a wealth of experience working in this space. Our final speaker is Ms. Yvette Keswick. I think all of you have seen her this morning. She's the technical advisor, science and services at the Pacific Climate Change Center. She has more than 10 years of work experience in the field of environment and climate change. She was the assistant resident representative and program manager for UNDP, involved in sector-based projects around forestry, integrated climate change, water resource management, and the environment in general in Samoa. She's has managed a variety of research and evidence-based projects throughout the Pacific. At the moment, she's the science to services advisor based at the Pacific Climate Change Center. Let's give a hand for you guys, please. Thank you, everyone. I will try to pose a couple of questions for our panelists. There are a couple of questions that have come online after our session this morning, so we will try to capture those as well, so that Professor Howden can also provide some feedback. By way of starting, I will ask the first question to Mr. Offer, the Director of Meteorology for Tonga. So this question goes like this, Offer. As a scientist, could you elaborate on the IPCC recent findings from the synthesis report and related Pacific climate change reports that have been released? And also as the chair of the WMO Science Report and Pacific Meteorological Met Desk, if you could elaborate on the role of the Pacific Met Desk, WMO, and the related science reports, and meteorological reports based on your experience and knowledge. So, Offer, is that question clear?
Thank you, Fred. First of all, I'd like to just say thank you for inviting me to be part of this dialogue in the next couple of days. When I flew over here this morning, I was trying to think if I ever attended an IPCC meeting. In my 25 years of working at the Met Service, this is my first IPCC meeting. I was sitting there listening to the, Professor Mark's report on the summary of the report. It occurred to me that perhaps there's some disjoint between the work of the climate change and work of the Met Services. But as we all know, that the Met Services function is mainly to collect data. That is what we've been doing for over a century, is collecting meteorological data. That's what we do. And here in the Pacific, where it's vast ocean, it becomes a much more important issue, because it's a very data sparse region, and all of these countries, developing countries, small Met Services, trying to collect the data required for this particular. So I think a lot of development has happened in the terms of the meteorological services. The development of the Pacific Meteorological Council, and the establishment of the meteorology desk that Fred was talking about, that SPREP, that coordinates all the work of meteorology within the region. And it's good, I think, to see the Pacific Climate Change Center starting to make an impact, and I see that perhaps some of these works trying to because I know that what we are trying to do is to try and contribute more into this report. Most of us, meteorological services, we provide the science for our national communications. And I mean, I can talk for myself, but that's probably it. We don't go further into research, and, you know, because the med services are geared to operation, and the resources are not enough. So we collect the data and we mainly just pass it on to scientists and institutes. A lot of the time outside the country, I think there's opportunities for the climate change sector to probably coordinate these activities, try and get some coordination between the med service and the institutions, the universities. I don't know if there's any med service in the Pacific that has a research MOU with USP, for example. I think it's an area that we can develop it and try and get these things going, but it's a challenge trying to do all these things more myself. The moderator talked about the weather ready Pacific concept initiative. This is a 10-year project program. We're looking to mostly to upgrade and to expand the observation networks in the Pacific over 10 years. There's a lot of money that needed to this investment, over $165 million required. Sort of, we've got some funding from the Australian government to start, but I think this gives us an opportunity to work together and try and get the research that we need going forward. When I attended COP and attended some of these side events of IPCC, I realized the amount of research that's been done and the level and the information available. But it remains there in the global, regional level. Coming down to the country level, it's difficult. There needs to be some work in this area. I mean, you cannot just generalize that this region has a decrease in tropical cyclones, for example. Some changes that were down in a very local scale. And it's something that we need to address. I don't know if I've answered your question, moderator, but I'll pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Alpha. I think you've done a good reflection on the question. We will come back to the questions later after everyone has spoken, so please, if you have any specific clarification that you would like, please take it down and we'll come back to you. We are very happy to have our panelists who is missing here now. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed, I will be very happy to introduce Mr. Howden, from the Cook Islands. He's been in this field for over 35 years, so you can imagine all the experience and knowledge that has been gained. So please talk to him as well. He is one of the most senior Pacific meteorological scientists in the region. Has served as the chair of the Pacific Meteorological Council, has extensive experience in science and climate change, and also has contributed to a number of scientific articles and publications. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Mr. Arona. So, as you can see, he just arrived, so he might need a cup of coffee later. Huh? Okay, so we will have our next speaker, Dr. Lutero. I have a question for you, which was prepared. As a contributing author to the IPCC 6 report, could you discuss your experience in your preparation of the report and submission, and also the approval process, and also reflect on your experience as a climate negotiator for someone, and some of the networks and connections that you been involved in during the UNFCCC negotiations. So there's two questions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I would like to say Atalifo to everyone. Very good to see everyone. Very happy to be part of this meeting. As Director Fortuna mentioned before, this is also my first IPCC meeting, and it's something that was never part of the discussion for such body. With regards to the question asked by the moderator, I'm not sure about the definition of the contributing author, but my involvement was I am one of the my publication was one of the cited, but the IPCC working group one, chapter 11 on weather and climate extreme events in changing climate. The topic of my paper was about tropical cyclones in Southwest Pacific, and you can access it on the internet. And as asked by the moderator to share my experience, that the paper was not it was published before IPCC report, and fortunately it was cited. So I was very happy having that paper on the IPCC. It was a very challenging experience. Trying something new, and I guess researchers in the room perhaps agree with that. With someone new trying to push through a paper, first paper, it was a very challenging after many failed attempts, and then finally was published. From the survey that was given out to us before some months ago, I think it was clear by the responses that was also mentioned by offer the lack of the Pacific representation in the process of IPCC. And there is a clear need for further guidance and clear pathways to participate in this IPCC report. And I believe that there is a very low awareness of us, especially us in the Pacific, of this, of the existence of the IPCC. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Very limited confidence in our Pacific research can be included in the IPCC. These are some of the feedbacks from the survey that was given out, and I agree with you. If we compare our Pacific region to other, this is with regards to science, meteorology science, if we compare to other regions, Europe, Asia, America, there's very few limited research available. And that is one of the challenges. Also mentioned by OFA, us working in the Pacific, in the med field. We only do the operation and there's no time to do research. I think this is where a partnership with the academic institute comes in. I'm very happy that I see in the last years there is some efforts on trying to work together with the research institute, because trying to conduct more robust research on this field on climate and meteorology. And one of the challenges during my work was the lack of data. We all know that we are in an ocean-dominated region, and there's very limited observations, which links to the limited research. We need data to do research, quality data. I'm also happy to see that recently, the past 5 years, 6 years, there's a lot of Pacific Med staff going further to do further studies. And I believe if we continue that way, and there is a very good chance that in the near future we will increase our involvement with the IPCC, especially in the report. The second part of the question, the work of the research and systematic observation with regards to the UNFCCC ecosystem. Last year was my first COP and some of us were there. And from that from COP, there was the convention calls on parties to promote and cooperate in research and systematic observation and development of data. It should be mentioned that the need for research and observation was one of the burning, one of the main topics that was discussed. And my colleagues from Pacific were all involved in trying to put through this issue. We may also recall that the Paris Agreement recognizes the need for taking action based on the best available science. What we want, the best available science, strengthening systematic observation and cooperation. From the meeting, the SEPTA, or the subsidiary body for science and technological advice, mandated the UNFCCC Secretary organize, based on some vision, the following annual forum to exchange information to support the work on research and systematic observation. So we have there is a research dialogue, and there is also Earth Information Day annual forum that we use to discuss some of these. The Pacific Island developing states priority also this is from some of the conclusions from COP27 raises concerns on state of global climate and seek the support from the systematic observation finance facility. And some of the Pacific Mates countries, Pacific Mates are part of this finance facility, which is set up to increase observation and data collection. So I believe that we have already voiced out our concerns from my opinion. The need to increase our involvement in research, which can be used as can be used to be in IPCC, and the enhancing or expansion of observation in order to collect base quality data. These are the main issues that I believe will assist us in trying to, to become more involved in the work of the IPCC and strengthen and building the relationship with our partner institute. As often mentioned, research itself, we cannot do research given the work that we are doing at that office. We need to strengthen our relationship and work with the university, the regional university, trying to do research. I think those are the things that we need to in order to increase our participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mateo. I think that reflections underscores the event that we have today as one of the best engagement on the IPCC process. And also region-wide the Pacific Climate Change Center, SPREP, is partnering with PNU in the process to ensure that more researchers are from a region engaged in the IPCC process. And I think Dr. Mateo has provided the context and understanding very well. His reflections are also good lead up to our next speaker. I think sometimes the cyclone is coming, maybe you will predict it without the data because of his long experience. But I am very, very privileged to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Aaron Nye, the Director Med for Cook Islands. And I have a specific question for you, which is a lead up to what Dr. David has mentioned. If you could share your experience being part of the IPCC experts working group over the years, and what are some of the challenges that you face as a scientist in getting more involved in the IPCC process, but also maybe some general reflection on your experience in terms of the response to climate change, but the science and some of the events that we are facing in the region right now. Mr. Aaron, please.
Thank you. Kia ora all. My name is Aaron. I just arrived from Auckland this morning because I was overloaded yesterday, but I wanted to be here so that we could make the importance of this particular issue here. I think Prof and Victor has alluded us to some of the issues that we as directors prefer to contemplate and look further in, while putting things like IPCC and company aside. As we all know that we are the core of the driver of El Nino, and the El Nino comes down. So we have an abundance of data, and we have, as looking with Dr. Lucas, that we are starting to go into research. So there should not be any particular to have shortage of data so that we can do research. Because all of that data and the research needed is required to be taken onto IPCC to prove that the science is proving that climate change is a concern. The challenges I've cited with probably with the last 10, 15 years with IPCC is our lack of participation of resolutions that we haven't taken part of this, and maybe because there's a lack of understanding of the process. We have gone through assessment reports, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're the 6th one, the synthesis report. All we as participants on the three islands are concerned about issue like 1.5 degrees Celsius. The field was an average. And something that can prick our ears when it was mentioned in the plenary report of IPCC. And we should also be indebted to the experience that has helped us a long way. If I just cite one, Dr. Mark Howden, who has been instrumental in ensuring that situation like this is brought to the fore so that we fully understand and comprehend and take part in more of these. A classic example I like to use in IPCC meeting has been the involvement of the AOSIP, and especially the Caribbean SID countries like Belize, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada. They have prepared statements when they come from their capital, and that could be something that we could reflect upon, but we also need academia, and this is where we need to reach out to USB, other universities. We're going to propose the shared working group seat on Solomon Islands that in the university USB, really to get our hold on issues that are near our I've also mentioned about our participation in COP meetings. This is also important, but we have to understand that we just need to have that dynamic, a system to get the ball rolling when attending sessions. We have been assisted in the past, and I think still been assisted with the amend or the review of the synthesis report from the experts. I personally feel that we should get them more involved, not only at the regional level, but also at the IPCC sessions, because this is where we need them to put our thinking caps on to see where we can promote. And if I just use an example of the recent IPCC, that one of the Caribbean states was left with tears because of the delayed process of getting a statement or the review of the synthesis report. And it could be a tactic, or it could be just the whole process. But this is where you and I are needing to be here. WMO IPCC Trust has a dedicated fund to get at these developing countries to IPCC sessions, so we can take that, but we need more, so that as other countries bring about 5 or 10, but it's been we just one man band there. So we just need the assistance of these guys, of the experts that has promoted a whole idea here in the industry. We just need the assistance as well as the tertiary institutions, the research people, to help us in getting our plan across to the IPCC. So that is the challenge that I see, and I hope that we pick up on that, considering that there are some opportunities for us to take part in these, and basically hopefully that no chemical cycle will come on operate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rona. That is a very good summary and reflection on the needs in the region. And I think from this conference onwards, I think we will work together and collaborate to strengthen our engagement and also our participation in the IPCC process going forward. Our third and final speaker is Ms. Eva Kesbeck, as I've introduced before. She is our technical advisor, science for services. I have a very specific question also for Yvette. And so the question is basically around elaborating on the role of the Pacific Climate Change Center as the Center of Excellence for Climate Change Information, and also reflecting some of its main functions in relation to the process of the IPCC, and finally to maybe provide a summary on the IPCC webinars that the center has hosted over the last year. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, Fred, and Tagaloa, everyone again. As the director alluded in our opening remarks today, the Pacific Climate Change Center is hosted at SPREP under the Climate Change Resilience Team. And in close partnership with the Australian National University, we hosted 3 Pacific webinars for the IPCC assessment reports, 6 assessment reports, and these are the 3 working groups. Working group 1 was on climate change, the physical science. Working group 2 looked at the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And working group 3 looked at climate change and mitigation. And I'm pleased to inform today we presented the synthesis report. And the main objective of this is to bring these global reports more into the Pacific context and in front of our Pacific audience in a manner that would be easily understood and in a way that we could contribute back up to these global reports. Because as you all know, we're all impacted by climate change as small island development states. And my fellow panelists also mentioned key areas that we need to improve, and that's why the leaders, our leaders in the Pacific, established the Pacific Climate Change Center. Some also identified the lack of data. Some also identified we need to connect the dots between research organizations or institutions and with our government scientists. There's also a need for participation in these global forums, but also identifying these in regional forums. So the Pacific Climate Change Center has 4 main functions. It's research, innovation, capacity building, and knowledge brokerage. So under the research function, we look at hosting research projects to address specific research objectives and priorities, and looking at prioritized research on the thematic areas which are priority in the Pacific region. This includes adaptation, mitigation, climate finance, and our forum today falls under the science services. And through this function, through our partnership with ANU, we have developed 11 fact sheets from the 3 working groups, and today we developed 4 fact sheets for the synthesis report. So in total, 15 fact sheets. Because we understand the technical report that is circulated, sometimes also we don't have time to read it. Sometimes you're required by your organizations, your institutions, or your governments to provide good feedback, policy advice. So that is the service that we would like to provide, providing these quick pop-up information based on science that could assist you in your work areas. And also, just to acknowledge, we've also tried to address this gap between the institutions. So unfortunately, not all our universities were able to attend today, but we do have ANU, we have the University of Melbourne, we also have our Pacific universities here, the National University of Samoa, We have the Fiji National University as well as the Samoa Research Organization. So from the Pacific Climate Change Center, we're trying to connect the dots, bring everyone together, and also develop science through the Pacific that we could also contribute back to the global level, so that we could be recognized and it trickles down back to our communities. So from the Pacific Climate Change Center, we are committed in using these IPCC findings, as well as looking at promoting more Pacific research as the scientific basis to provide science and products to be used by Pacific Island countries in climate action, as guided by regional frameworks that are in place, but also as prioritized by our national policies with our Pacific Island. We believe that the science to services function will provide a gateway for the Pacific out of the climate science and towards more sustainable future for our Pacific Island countries and territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. And we will have one more speaker. I think Professor Mark, I will put you on the spot. Having heard from the three colleagues from the Pacific, also then directors in meteorology, maybe you can provide some reflection on the engagement of Pacific researchers, but also the role of meteorological services in providing science and the work of the IPCC. So, Professor Mark, I'll give you a bit of time to provide some reflections. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred, for that. So I think we've heard a range of views which have got very consistent elements in them, and those are about the important roles of the Met services in terms of operational activities, the need to connect the information and data that they and store and curate to other people, so other researchers and various users, and to ensure that capability is actually deployed in a way that generates benefit across the Pacific. And so I think there's some really strong messages coming in there. There's also a message from my perspective, which is that the IPCC, even though it's a really important global institution, which in a sense connects the research with policy action, with increasingly with industry and community action as well, is not well understood across the Pacific. And that's why I think the subsequent workshop we've got here today is potentially very useful in terms of identifying pathways where people can more effectively engage in IPCC roles. And so Marlani and Sylvain, Steve and Yvette and I are running that workshop, so we can perhaps remove some of the fog that's failing better action by people across the city in terms of the IPCC, and through that more effective engagement with UN Framework Convention meetings, the COP meetings, and similar activities. So I think as a I guess my role as a vice chair in the IPCC has been to have an oversight in terms of the process and the integrity of the process, the direction of the IPCC process, and through that, I think it's very clear to me that whilst the Pacific has been represented in terms of the research, with the Terra talk about some of his contributions there, there's also contributions through people like Arona at the IPCC plenaries. There's a shortfall in terms of where the Pacific is now versus where it could be in terms of engagement with IPCC and similar processes.
Thank you, Professor Mark. I think we'll go to our second part of our session, which is for questions. We have a couple of people joining us online, so given they are not here with us, maybe we will go to the 2 questions online, and then we'll open it up for those of us who are here at this moment. So we have maybe 2 questions that are we will take from those online. One is from Harmonic. And so panelists, please, if you can listen carefully, I will read it out. It says monitoring of meteorological and marine conditions will continue to be extremely important. What observations should Pacific prioritize? What observations should Pacific Islands prioritize over the next decade? Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is from Wendy Ringbird, okay, and it reads, what are Pacific Island countries planning to adapt for in terms of strengthening their homes to be more resilient to extreme weather events and tropical cyclones? So this is, I think this question is around planning maybe basic home infrastructure, especially in the context of extreme events of tropical cyclones. What are the options, or what would be options for forecasting? Okay, thank you. So maybe we'll just have any two panelists who is willing to respond to the question.
Thank you, Fred. Maybe you can respond to the first question. What is also required? We all know that the issue of sustainable rights is becoming more for us. If we may recall, the last year around July, a few of island nations were impacted by coastal inundation. And with regards to the question, I believe that having more observation from the ocean and sea dive gauges to collect data, ocean data, the sea temperature, all those related to those parameters related to the climate and ocean. We need more of the sea level dive gauges. And also note that the issue of ocean acidification is another issue. This can, if we have these equipment, we can use to monitor what's the pH of the ocean is, and which is also related to our efforts to adapt. There's a lot of implications, and a lot of impacts caused by ocean to some of the marine ecosystems, coral, coastal ecosystem. So having more dive gauges and sea observation, it's needed. Collecting sea temperature, the pH of the seawater, and all those kind of data that we need. We are lacking that type of data nowadays, and I know that only few of us here in the room, Met Services, operating these instruments. Can give the mic to sports center.
The second question is around infrastructure. Didn't want infrastructure basically in the homes. Maybe Professor.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks for the questions to Carl and Renee. So just a quick comment in terms of monitoring. So there's different takes on this. So one sort of way of viewing this is like an everything everywhere all at once sort of idea, to take a line from the recent movie, and which can be important. And so we actually have a long-term record of a whole range of different values, parameters across our systems. And I would argue that being part of global partnerships, which look at things like ocean observing systems, etc., is really important. So if we're looking at ocean acidification, it's not separate what happens in the Pacific isn't separate from what happens in other ocean places. There's another sort of view about sort of monitoring, which is actually particularly having priorities where the monitoring is closely tied to action. So where you can actually sort of look at the value proposition from monitoring activity because it actually informs specific course of action. So, for example, heat warning systems, when they're effective and when they're tied to action plans, can demonstrably reduce mortality and illness across populations who have those warning systems. Similarly, our warning systems in terms of cyclones demonstrably reduce loss of human life with cyclones and hurricanes over the last decades. So where you have monitoring systems that are closely tied to action, I think there's a specific priority there, which is going to be contextual. So some places don't get cyclones, so they don't need cyclone warning plans and early warning systems, for example. So I think there's different elements there, but really taking a strategic view on this is important because zoning and resources. So the question about what should Pacific peoples adapt for, is in the sense of what I think it was asking is that what are the temperatures, what are the sea level rises, what are the changes in cyclone strength, etc. That provides a fundamental rationale for adaptation, which is the why should we adapt, because there's some degree of certainty about specific changes. I think from my perspective, the more important questions that we should be moving on towards is who adapts, how they adapt, sort of when do they adapt, because it's not always given that next week is the best time. And also, importantly, the question about how well that adaptation works, so that we can actually monitor different adaptations and improve them over time. So we actually have an evolutionary perspective on it in terms of adaptation. So from my perspective, that means we have to move the point of information from sort of groups such as meteorological services to include agencies such as agencies that deal with water, agencies that deal with health, communities that have got concerns about energy security, communities, people that have concerns about food security. So moving the communities that we're engaging with towards those points of action where people can take actions that are in their interest.
Thank you, Professor Mark. I think that's a good response to the question. We will now open the floor for those of us who are here. Please, maybe you can just raise your hand and then we'll bring the mic up to you, and our friend here will run the mic. So we have a first question on side.
Thank you. My name is Gwen. I'm with the Climate Change Authority of Papua New Guinea. And I want to thank the panelists for sharing your insight to this important process of the IPCC and climate change, which in my view is the role of IPCC is not very clear in my country as the national focal point of PNG, as well as coordinating climate change in the country, and how research that we could potentially do in country, it contributes to the work of the IPCC. So perhaps further workshopping of the IPCC would be important to PNG, and I'm sure for the region. Like for issues that you raised, like monitoring versus research, what counts, what contributes to the next IPCC report, and what areas to prioritize, who sets those priorities. Does IPCC have a list of research gaps that you require data for? and that the countries and the region will assist with. And then who supports that, because we all know, as Professor Howden also says, funding and technical support capability does not really exist in many areas of climate change. So prioritizing, really knowing what you research for to contribute to the IPCC versus what you research for to improve the implementation for adaptation in country. I think these are things that we need clarity on, so we can all work together to, to address climate change. But otherwise, I think for us it's very important that we are here to learn from you. So we also organize in country on how we deal with IPCC issues. Thank you.
Okay, maybe now, two more questions. Introduce yourself.
My name is Pippen. I work for the Fiji Meteorological Service. So my question is with reference to so in Fiji Meteorological Service, the focal point for IPCC. And in the past, we have coordinated the work of IPCC, for example, nominations for authors for different reports. One of the things which we have noticed is that, the academic institutions who are based in Fiji, while they realize the importance of the work of IPCC, but I guess there's lack of incentive for academics to contribute to the work of IPCC. So I just wanted to hear from the panel on how we can, incentivize the academic institutions in the region. They are more up for contributing to the work of IPCC. Thank you.
One more question?
Thank you very much, again, George, from the Australian National University. So you can hear from the conversation, the reflection of the two things, mobilizing for the next report, but I'd also like to ask for suggestions on mobilizing using the existing report, and what, especially to Mark, with your view of how the report has been utilized by countries and regions around the world. What have been some best practices? And I know you mentioned this in your original lecture, but it's also about what we need to do with the current report at hand. And so if you could also give a little bit more in terms of best practice in other countries, to also provide somewhat a roadmap while we are working on mobilizing for the next report. But what can we do, and what should we be doing also, considering best practices of other countries and other institutions on the existing report?
Thank you. It sounds like Mark might have to go first. So Mark, I'll hand over to you to have very good questions around national level approach, and then from Fiji Met on incentives for participation and question from George. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for those questions. So when thanks for that feedback about sort of IPCC processes not being clear, and I think that's very much why we're actually having this event here, to actually provide some clarity. And as I mentioned, there's a workshop later today where hopefully that will be more clear. And in fact, it'd be good to get some feedback from you after that workshop, whether there is more clarity. So when we look at IPCC is built fundamentally on research. So it doesn't do research itself. What it does is it pulls in research from many different sources, many different sources to actually synthesize and assess the state of knowledge and the way in which that knowledge is being used, and specifically on climate change. So the question then is, well, one of the questions is how to actually get the array of information, research information, in a format and accessible for the authors in the IPCC chapters to use to actually get hold of, to be able to synthesize and abstract it and assess it. And so there is a fundamental step there, which is actually enabling the research to be done, the underpinning research. The IPCC, some of the chapters, not all, I think, have a research gaps section. So, for example, in the past chapters I've worked on with food security, we identify a series of research gaps for each chapter. So there'll be something on water, something on food, etc. So there are research gaps there. The bigger process to assess research gaps, in a sense, is the scoping processes that happen with IPCC. So that's a large scale consultation process with the research community and the policy communities that identifies the things that are going to be addressed in each assessment cycle within each assessment report. And within that, you can identify gaps that need to be filled in the report that may have been underdone in the past. And so engaging in that scoping process is a way of ensuring that gaps you observe are filled through the IPCC process. The IPCC also contributes to essentially incentivizing, to use the word that was asked there, for catalyzing research on particular topics. So at the for this IPCC cycle, very early on, we decided to have a report on what was called 1.5 degrees report. What are the implications of keeping temperatures down to 1.5 degrees versus 2 or higher temperatures? And at that time, there was very, very little research on what 1.5 degrees meant. You know, what did it mean in terms of impacts? What did it mean in terms of adaptation? So with almost no literature base on which to use base that special report. So essentially, the IPCC put a call out to the research community to produce that literature in time for that special report, and the research community actually responded, and so generated a huge amount of research in a relatively short period of time, which was then able to be synthesized into that special report. It had a very, very significant impact. So the 1.5 degrees report, in some ways, was the most, in my view, the most impactful report in the whole IPCC cycle. So that was a way in which sort of the policy demands in relation to 1.5 degrees catalyzed through the IPCC a huge amount of research, filling a research gap. In terms of the author nominations, so I think Given was the name, got it right, is that so IPCC focal points and observer organisations can collate names of people that put in their hand up for IPCC author roles and review editor roles. And so they act as a focal point to collate that information, which then gets put into a selection process, which is run by the IPCC Bureau, and we'll cover the details of this afternoon. And so people who want to engage, in a sense, have to put their hand up and have to be on that nomination list. Otherwise, they simply aren't part of the process. And so that's an important step that people need to sort of have an eye on. In terms of the incentives, there's not that many incentives to work on IPCC. This is unpaid work. You know, so all of my work on IPCC over the years is all pro bono. It's all unpaid. It's all on top of my day job. So there's no monetary incentive. With the exception of the IPCC Secretariat, who are WMO employees, there are no paid people in IPCC. Unless governments of those people choose to pay them. So there's no monetary benefit, there's no salary, there's nothing to do that. There is a service element, so it's people who are engaged in IPCC because they see that this is actually contributing to essentially making a better world and actually contributing to the state of knowledge and the ability for that knowledge to be used And also there's an element of IPCC, authorship and other roles that will put on your CV. So there's a personal benefit in that sense. And in terms of mobilizing for the this existing report, mobilizing for AR7, I think, George, that if we look at the synthesis report, it's only been out for a few weeks, so there's still plenty of room to move to get that better known. And so at the moment, I'm sort of doing probably about 3 briefings a week for different organisations across Australia, some community-based, some industry-based, some government, and just sort of talking through them what the synthesis report means. And I expect that will go on for some time. The question of impact is still too early to say in relation to that. But I think if you look at the previous outputs of IPCC this cycle, 1.5 degrees report, etc., I think that they have had significant impact. And so you can trace discussions in place that back to the IPCC reports, etc. So I think that they have had an impact in that sense. The roadmap forward, I think from my perspective in the Pacific, is what we'd like to see, this is IPCC and us and others, is a much more robust and much more comprehensive set of contributions to the IPCC in the next round than was in AR6. So it wasn't absent. So Morgan Wairu and others had very significant roles in the 6th assessment cycle. But I think we can do more, and we can do more on many different levels. And so as we will talk about this afternoon, we added up, there's something like 13 different roles that people can play in IPCC processing. And so there's lots of niches that people can actually contribute to, which they may not be aware of at this stage.
Thank you, Professor Mark. Any of the panelists want to respond as well? With it?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mark. Just on the research institutions, this is one area that we're looking at from the Pacific Climate Change Center. Although we're only 2 years in operation, we're looking at strengthening this partnership between research institutions within and outside the region. And we're starting with this process. It's worked well so far with our webinars, our regional dialogue in person, and we're working closely, as Professor Howden said, in the future, looking at workshops and developing journals or articles that can be recognized, for example, the IPCC process, but also looking at other processes where our research institutions will be interested in, together with our government colleagues. But also areas that are priority within the Pacific. So we're also looking at working closely with other universities in other priority areas in different areas that they are specialized in. So we could have a wide outreach in terms of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. I'll be mindful of time as well. We have 5 minutes, so we'll take another 3 questions, and then we'll go for answer. And Terry, I think you have the first question from Fiji. Thank you, moderator, and all the panel members. Most probably just a comment from me. Especially the work promoting the work of IPCC in this region, and the fact that I know that it's probably most of the countries in the region, their IPCC focal points are the Met directives. I'm not sure if this is staying across the region, but I realize that the Met service is starting promoting IPCC more than ever at the national level. And I think the concept of the Pacific Forum for Climate or Climate Outlook Forums, we can use a similar concept to promote climate change or findings about the IPCC latest findings. So
in the Pacific, the Met community, before every wet and dry season, they have a Pacific Island Climate Outlook Forum. And then from that regional forum, the national Met services take that information and promote it at the national level. But we don't do it for climate change. And I was looking at our manager climate service. I think this is an event where the Met directors can, you know, after the PCC meeting at the regional level, at the national level, the meteorological service can promote these kind of findings at the national level. So I was just talking to Tagaloa, he promised me about funding, but I think we will pilot this in Fiji in our next financial year to promote the work of IPCC at the national level. So I thought I'd just put it across, and maybe a suggestion to PCC to support this kind of work in the future. Thank you.
Thanks. It's just a question to Mark about the Synthesis Report. I was struck by the influence the government's putting a further outline and scoping in the summary for policymakers. And in the Working Group 2 report, there was no one from the region, but there was a chapter about the region, about small islands. There was no one from the region, but there was a chapter about insecurity. So the other part of this, we talked about that now later, is the importance of turning up on the government side as well, because that's also really important.
Did you get the last question?
I guess not a question, but something for the facilitators too. I think it's also important that we have a little bit focus on the challenges of research institutions. We do have a challenge of many research and taking that on board, but also challenges of universities here in the Pacific. So just something to add on, so that we also take on board why it's also difficult for universities to collaborate. So we can put that also in the open and look at forward-looking in preparation for MOUs and good practices, so that the work is easy flowing. So just something like that for people to upcoming sessions, the challenges of research institutions.
Thank you. I think we don't have any final questions, so I will give it to the panelists. I think, Roma, you want to reflect on the comment by Terry and the role in medicines?
I totally support these things what you're saying. IPCC focal points actually will be allocated to materials. There are also some countries that the focal point is the environment services, and some are the climate change policy. The difficulty we had in the past is that there's always been lack of participation by some of the IPCC focal points, and this is where we start to lag in our contribution towards the appropriate reports. We have voted IPCC in the last PMC that was held in Samoa to bring someone from the technical support group, actually promote IPCC work, and it could be something that we can do with. But I think with the presence of IPCC with the SPREP, we'll be doing that on a more rigorous basis. And also with other projects coming up with PMC and the national and some national resources, we can incorporate some of these into these, knowing that we can as a supporter of climate change with the monitoring and the research that we can actually go along with. But we just want to make sure that we know our IPCC focal points are, And the last, as I mentioned previously, that we can circulate, all of the IPCC focal points for the district region. So that, we can start promoting them the importance of the district. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mark, you want to respond to the question by Professor John?
That's great. So I think just a quick comment on the IPCC focal points in that my observation over many IPCC cycles is the arrangements within government have changed. And so you know, in the second assessment cycle when I was originally involved, climate change was not a big issue for most governments, and so it was pushed sort of down the list of government departments' responsibilities. These days, it's a big issue for many governments because it's you know, pertaining to their you know, energy systems, their health systems, etc. And so it tends to get elevated and centralised as the focal point. And so one of the questions I guess is evaluating country by country, which is where is the best place to actually put an IPCC focal point in a way that actually gets serviced effectively and which can communicate to the various components, the various sort of groups that have an interest in climate change. So the question about the sort of evolution of the arrangements I think the Climate Outlook Forum is a good suggestion, and I know that many different countries and regions run sort of climate outlook forums. They're a great way of transferring information within the community and providing a sort of a point of communication for these forthcoming conditions. So we increase the authority of the information that's coming out. And just to mention that my colleague Steve Prim has been involved in this for many years, different continents, and is also working actively in research about how to get better forecasts than the current ones that are available on forecasts. And lastly, John, in terms of influence of governments, etc., absolutely. The IPCC, the name tells that it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's actually the governments who own the panel, not the researchers, although the researchers think they do. But it's actually governments who you know, are both design the process and are the recipients of the information in the process, and they're involved in many steps of the process, but not all steps of the process. And it's a very interesting partnership where that the information that you know is finally presented is actually information that is agreed by both governments and the research community. So there's nothing in an IPCC, say, summary for policymakers that is not that does not yet pass by the scientists, the researchers on that approval process. If it isn't consistent with the science, it doesn't get through. And so there is a strong filter there that ensures that the information is consistent with science. At the same time, different governments can play games in which some of the issues are not fully represented or represented in to the degree in which as scientists think they should be. So there are significant and important roles for government. Some of them are positive and some of them not quite so positive. But I think you can't play in that sandpit unless you actually turn up and part of the process. So the fact that Arona do turn up to these meetings is really important because it means there is a specific voice in the room that actually says, you know, the opportunity to put your hand up and say, hey, that it's not quite like that for us, or there's missing the issues that are really important to this region. And so, you do need governments to turn up to these processes so that they can actually counter the other views that might come from other governments which may not be as aware of the importance of some of these things that you are.
Thank you, Professor Mark. Please.
Thanks, Fred. Just in terms of coordination of terrorism, the Pacific Med Council, it has a few working groups. One of them is on education and training and research. I think Arona is the chair of this. I think if the Pacific Climate Change Center plays a more visible role in this working group or coordinates within this working group, I think it will assist at least connecting the Met Services and the climate change on the regional level, and that will trickle down to the national Met Services as well. That is another way. I think it was you, Professor, who talked about the impacts earlier today. And when we're talking about downscaling, the data that's collected from the sectors, energy, health, all of this is very, very lacking in the Pacific. Sometimes we want to go and do research. The climate data is there, but you go there and try and get some data on dengue fever, for example. It's not there. So it's the question that was raised by Prof Mark Howden, I think I totally understand now where she's coming from in terms of the gaps in the data. These are the sort of things that event you should write down vigorously and try to figure out the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ofa. I think that's a good summary for our session this morning, Ofa. Unless there are any other final comments from the panelists. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of IPCC and the host to say thank you. Also, our director is here. Just to say thank you to the panelists for making yourself available. I want to ask us to put our hands together and give a applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. And also thank you to those of you who have joined us online. We appreciate you participating. Please don't go. We're going to